Hello, everybody.
Welcome to the first panel discussion of the North Country Art, Land and Environment Summit.
The topic of this panel is rivers, water, and life.
So without further ado, we'll pass the word to Sateiokwen, who will give the opening address.
Danchitawanu holata nesungwa piso kalihanke tandalo. Ohantakali watekwa anke wamano hitste. Danchitawanu holata nesungwa piso jinaho dansulos anyala gutakutana lowiana da na hunjake. Hitonya dak ningwani gula. Wani salata yungwa gat the lolu now the wake na duaka ayon jinio don't hage jinat the doadela nungwa sua. Ayon leka gweko skana ji the wanutunya jinio gwetike kahnoa ya hitwayat the yeli. Hitonya dak ningwani gula. Ona no e no nan jito wadeni ko haela te nei kitni sta hunja ne jito ko tkamo hake jina ho tanso yung gyun hekwa. Yotsunon ya jiseko te yung kishnege dano jiseko yung kihawisun ngweso dano kadio taso jini galiwesa hunja te yung gotoania. E tonya dak ni ngwani gula. Ona no e jito wagela te ne ohne gatsu ne lo welo ngahne kolunya ge jo hunja te e no e ni to wetana yung wahat na na yung kwanya data. Nya de kasat stan salage de wa yandeli ka nekalunyu, chikanyanda la goa, chikanyanda la hele, chikanyanda la lunyu, chikahyo hatenyu jio huada ya, o honja konsiyo tneka tekyo hage jita wa santa jio kanala sana jam hoines. Uska jian dita wa hue nuni ne ngwani gula, ne yoli wage and dita watka wa nekano hala junsala, e tonya dak ne ngwani gula. Tanagati ehnua ni kundida lo ne kia te kancha getana ujino wa sua, ne desagowi da kundota ho chikah nekalunyu. Neoni dainat kama hake ne ngwatanatsala ne ngwayata nilata ne tonyo dohak ne ngwani gula. Neona hnuen hanjito wate ni guhayela te ne jinio jite kahanda yando. Yate otka lockdown hunja gwego dayo hnyo hake sungwayan towen yate kundi satstan salage ne hunde sua. Ayala skiot kwe na hake ne tonyo dohak ne ngwani gula. Neona hnuen hanjito wate ni guhayela te ne ngwatanatsala ne ngwage. Ne jini hoyelo hunja gweko de tolato ne anun kwasua. Ne yona deli hunde a elun kundi hawita ne kanu hok dansala. Gyotko yodi halegestano yana data wayana daun ayoko jante. Yotsunanya chiseko diundungwe diastations. Ne elun ehle jin yodi analasalo danso ne anun kwasua. Wanagadina ne danjetinu holada ne anun kwasua. Dano jini ungweteke de hodikwa jilundino kwatsala nuhne. Etonia dog ne gwatni gula. Anska jenti doa wet nuni na gwani gula dano nue nanji doa gela tene gyun hekwa. Yetsa nuni achi seko di ngosh nege ne gayan tosala jini galiwe so hunjaga di ngo doali. Etania dat ne gwani gula. Ona nue nanji doa gela tene kahi sua. Ne chi seko doa tgatos ne gunda doa nio gatnyo hundesa. Gahata geha sa ize dano neskana guantalano. Anska jenti doa wet nuni na gwani gula dano deitinu hulada ne kahi sua. Etania dat ne gwani gula. Askanti doa wet nuni ne ngwani gula dan de tinulata ne gundilio ne hunja gwego sakotkawa. Ogiake yatika ste na dawani hage aktunge jingo daskwa hunyo jikaha oni jikaha hunyo. Yotsanunya ehnuya livage jiseko yatikas ne gundilio etonya dat ne gwani gula. Onanu ehnuana jito wat etniko hayela ne yolivage ne gwila sua. Ogiake tonue ni doa de la kwe hostakwa dana ogiake yo hyant dunyo. Yotka dage lonat kwila lagwa ne ngwa sua, etonya dak ne gwani gula. Anska jienti doa wet nuni ne ngwani gula dana de tinu halata na uji dan ugua, chiungwa tenu jista tenu gundi genunges, negatine esa gola nawe agudela no daskana kayandige johunjade, etonya dak ne gwani gula. Onanue nuni gula dani guhayela de jiat doat santos nue tadianta kwa ne inkisitigu ala duelas. Tuoni na kalawanyas nona ale dundayam halele, dahatihne kahawina as en sununi jihunjade, etoni dot ne gwani gula. Onanue nunan jidua gela de jinio jila guadagwa lawelo gayandake ne gasat stansala sun an gayeli ni gawalage. La diwela lasta jihunjade, as en sununi jinio jidawa dunie, oni jine de hotidanu haka jinio guagan hotans, etoni dot ne gwani gula. Askandi doa wet nuni ne gwani gula dano. Dan chito wano halata ne sangwachi agyo Kanien'keha galakwa. Yotsanunya jiseko de hoswa tete dana lutali hat no hage jio hunjade. Etoni dak ne gwani gula. Naji nanji dwaya laska jianti dwawe no ni na gwani gula don de chino huelado ne asunta neso. Nue giagon salagesne, nkiso tagalakwa. Naji sego yatiga stano, jisego yago detnyan dastu hage, gatni kahawaji dahoti dan hage, etonia dot ne gwani gula. Anaga nanji dwagela de no jisto kwa su danjetino huelado asunta neso yatigas. De hodiswa te do oni jine elo aweasta neskana jiago dunha dandi ne jine hoda sungwa toa jingwa te gelo. Tonya dot ngwani gola. Askandi doa huet nuni ne ngwani gola dana de tinu hulato ne jini gailo and deli hunda hunda ni gola la ne gaho jila gelo ne dosa tena hana dala swaksa huana dawayato. Ne junkia hiala kwa jini jila welo ne dayon doali ne ngwesu Tonya dot ngwani gola. Ona no ya ti dawa wana ni halatne ne jino to da denak de lagwani ne sungwa dizo. It's an unya ne da yut katunya ne li wagwego. I like sungwana lo kwane jisego yo dio daga jinyo jisagoli hoyandakwa. Jino ho dansu losu ne jihunjade. Andi dawa dawa yando noe anda wa dawa na yela de. Easy not galunya di nega di wahi andi dawa gatwa nega no hala dunsala. Tonya dak ne gwani gula. Ona noe ya heta wa wene yo yohe. Zedawali wan hodungo, jino hot dansu wa dawa not dunyo. Yaki, dawa get ni kuhnuni dakat na hodak and get ni goha, jizaway datsu git ne ona wat wali fayandakwa, a jizawat ga when nagano hola dunsala. Etonya dak nangwani goa. I just wanted to do a quick opening for everybody. It's the words that come before all else, the Ohantakalihwa Dekwa. And we start this before we do all matters. It's to help bring together everybody under one mind, Scott Nigula, and it's to help remind everybody present that even though we have things going on in our lives personally or professionally, maybe you had a bad day or things aren't going well or you're just distracted, this is to kind of bring us all back together and to acknowledge all of creation, that we all depend on all these things and we start from the ground up. We even acknowledge one another and that we stay open-minded and peaceful. Then we go from our Mother Earth, that she still carries us and provides everything that we need to sustain us. We move to the waters, which are very important, which we'll be talking about today. All the different types of waterways, the rains, the mists, the waterfalls, the rivers, the lakes. Then we go into the fish and how they sustain us and clean the waters, to the different plants, whether they be medicine, grasses, foods, our gardens, the trees. Then we go to the top of the trees and there's the birds, that they still carry their songs and lighten our hearts and our spirits. The four winds, the sun, our brother the sun, that he still shines his light to help things grow and that he provides us warmth and strength. Our grandmother moon, that she still shines down on us. The stars that help mark our way when we get lost. The four beings and Sungwayat is our creator. And if there was anything else that I missed, I didn't mean to cause any harm, but if there was something I missed, then it's for everybody else to give thanks in their own way. So, yeah.
Yum. Thank you so much, Sateiokwen. So now,
My name is Blake Ladia.
and my name is Simu Aguilar Itzo.
And on behalf of the North Country Art, Land and Environment Summit, we want to thank all our participating partners.
The people, the organizations, the land, and the water that helped make this summit possible. We also want to acknowledge the funders who also made these events happen. We want to thank New York Humanities, the National Endowment of the Humanities, the St. Lawrence University Arts Collaborative Grant, and the Richard F. Brush Art Gallery.
And this specific event is happening in tandem with the Richard F. Brush Gallery's exhibition, Water and Origin, honoring and protecting the first storyteller.
And finally, we will pass you to the moderator of this panel, the moderator of Rivers, Water, and Life, Sandhya.
Thank you. Thank you to Sateiokwen for sharing those words with us. And thank you also to Sinsun and Blake for organizing and facilitating this entire summit, the North Country Art, Land, and Environment Summit. I'm Sandhya Ganapathy. I'm the moderator, and I'm an assistant professor of global studies at St. Lawrence University. So I'd like to welcome everyone. Welcome our panelists. Welcome to all of those out there joining us on Zoom and through the Weave News. Welcome to this inaugural event of the North Country Art, Land, and Environment Summit, and this particular roundtable on rivers, water, and life. Before we proceed, we must begin by acknowledging the lands and waters which make all of this possible, the traditional territory of Haudenosaunee peoples. We must also acknowledge the historical and ongoing violence that's been enacted upon these lands and waters and upon Haudenosaunee people. And it is the consequence of this violence that makes this conversation necessary. And I want to speak for a moment just from my own position as a settler, as a non-Indigenous person who now calls this area home. And I think about how I am challenged to reflect on how so many of the institutions and organizations that I take for granted, that I sort of participate in a regular basis. The institutions and organizations that also have helped to make this event possible, how they are also built upon Haudenosaunee lands. And in that way, they are also linked to this violence. And so this is a contradiction that I have to grapple with and that I think about as I try to better understand this place that I now call home. And so I would like to welcome other people who are positioned similarly as I am to do the same, to sort of grapple with these contradictions. For me, it's part of a learning process. It's part of a learning process, to learn more about this place I call home, as well as part of a process of working towards a more just, regenerative, life-giving, and life-sustaining future. And so this panel discussion, this conversation, is a part of that process. So let's get started. So I just wanted to say a few words about how we are going to organize this. So essentially what we will do, I'm going to start with just some prefacing remarks to contextualize the conversation. And then we'll do some quick introductions for each of the panelists. So each of the panelists will introduce themselves and say a few words about themselves. Then we will turn to their presentation. So each of the panelists has prepared, a 5 to 7 minute long presentation that they will share with us. And then we'll have time for conversation and discussion. And to begin, I'll just share some brief prefacing remarks to help contextualize this conversation within the contemporary moment that we all find ourselves in. So our conversations are going to center primarily on the St. Lawrence River watershed. But this summit opens at a time of broad-based public reckonings. Reckonings that have been in the making for several years and quite frankly for several centuries. Most recently, we can see this in the devastating impacts of COVID-19, which is especially pronounced in marginalized, minoritized, impoverished communities. We can also see this in the global mobilizations in support of Black lives. We can see this in the ongoing efforts of Standing Rock water protectors to secure the health, the water, and the lands of Oceti-Sakowin peoples. We see this in the efforts of community organizers and public health activists in Flint, Michigan, trying to get some redress for the poisoning of the Flint River and then the subsequent poisoning of people, many of whom are children. And so what all of these seemingly separate, disparate reckonings have in common is that they reveal some of the failures of colonizing society and the dangers that it poses for water and for life. But at the same time, where all these reckonings are happening, people also continue to live and continue to engage with their social and natural worlds, with land, with water, with each other. And the purpose of this panel is to reflect more pointedly on the various ways that people engage with the waters of the St. Lawrence River watershed, and to reflect on the water's life-giving possibilities. The panelists all come from very different lived experiences, cultural traditions, forms of expertise, and they will speak about their relationships with the waters of these Haudenosaunee territories of the Kanien'keha Mohawk people. And then we will also reflect on the future. So how we can work towards more sustainable, just, and life-giving futures. And so with that, I'd like to turn to our panelists. And so I think I will just go in the order that I have you listed, and just for a brief introduction, and then we'll turn to the presentations. So Iakonikonriiosta, would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. Iakonikonriiosta you get, which means she makes them have good thoughts. I'm very happy to be here tonight, and I work for the Akwesasne Museum. We're in Akwesasne, and we're dedicated to sharing our culture with our community that maybe just becoming aware of our culture, and neighboring communities and our visiting public. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Jessica Jock?
Yes, hi, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel and discussion. I'm Jessica Jock. I was born and raised here in the North Country, grew up swimming in the St. Lawrence River, and I have a background in environmental science and engineering, and I've worked for the St. Regis Mohawk Tribe's Environment Division for 18 years on some of the waterways here that are specific to the Akwesasne Mohawk territory.
Thank you. Next, Sateiokwen.
Every single time. Sateiokwen Hello everybody, my name is Sateiokwen. I'm Snipe clan. I was born and raised here in Akwesasne. I love to put my Zoom on mute and start talking. I also have my own business called Snipe Clan Botanicals, where I create plant-based products that I make out of things that I grow or pick in the wild, and just try to provide those products for people in Akwesasne, and also to teach them how to use that. I also work with Jessica Jock as her traditional ecological knowledge, as a consultant as traditional ecological knowledge for the St. Regis Tribe's Environment Division.
Thank you. Next, Lee Willbanks.
I thank Sandhya. I'd like to start by just saying I think we should all thank Talking Wings, Sinsun and Blake for the incredible amount of work and passion they brought to bringing this together. I'm very honored to be part of this and to be on this panel with everybody else from whom I've already learned quite a bit in our practice sessions. I am, I guess, an itinerant environmental advocate, currently not employed by any environmental organization, but working with several community organizations, unfortunately some of them in Canada, where it's no longer possible to visit in person, but working through organizational and issue-related topics with them. And I'm also counsel to the New York State Tug Hill Commission, which serves an area just to the west of the Adirondacks and the east of Lake Ontario.
Thank you, Lee. And last we have Shane Rogers.
Hello, thank you. Like Lee, I'm thankful to be here tonight. I think the idea behind this is very powerful and meaningful, especially in the time that we live in these days. I'm a professor of environmental engineering at Clarkson University, and I come here via Iowa and then Cincinnati. I worked for the US EPA for a number of years there before coming here. I'm also the owner of a small consulting firm. I do recently expert witnessing and working with people who need help, really, in dealing with environmental pollution issues and their impacts on their own public health. And I try to do work globally, bringing access to needed resources of people, including water and those sorts of things. And I guess my best connection to the place here, I think, my funnest connection is that I'm also a musician with an indie rock band, the Bee Children, and we're local here. And so I really enjoy the area and the unique aspects that are up here that I don't have anywhere else in the world. And so very happy to be here and joining the panel.
Thank you, Shane. So again, welcome to all of our panelists. And so I want to jump right in. And I think I'd like to start with Iakonikonriiosta, our first speaker.
I was asked to be part of it because they were looking for artists who would express themselves or express their culture through their art. And I make quilts. And what I've been able to do over the years was to be able to tell stories with my quilts. And when Blake and Sutsing came to the museum, they asked me to help them get in contact with other artists in the community who also had shared the culture that we have here in the community. I was able to get them involved with a couple of the artists, and hopefully some of the pieces you'll see at the museum in Canton. One of the films that they're going to show, I think they'll be starting it really soon, is a little video of the quilt that I made. What they had asked me to do was to think about water and origin. And that was actually very easy to do because in our creation story, at the beginning of the world, the whole world was covered in water. There was nothing else. There was no, there was not even light. There was no land. And when you think of what that would look like, that is what took my inspiration for this quilt. In the beginning, the sky woman falls from the sky, and she is coming to a new world to start a whole new creation. She falls from the sky, and as she's falling from the sky, the waterfowl will look up and they see that she is coming down, and they worry for her, and they want to be able to catch her in their wings and slowly bring her down into the earth. And they are really concerned that there is no place for her to land. And so they hold her on their wings while the water animals get together and they have a little council, and they decide that the best thing for her is to be able to land on the turtle's back, because the turtle is bigger than all the other animals. So she lands on the turtle's back, and the animals are concerned that the turtle's back is a little bit hard, and so it would be nice if they could bring up some soil from the bottom of the sea that they know exists down there. And if they're able to do that, it would make her to be able to walk on the earth in a much softer place. So the beaver and the otter tried to go down there and to try to get some of the soil, but they're not able to do that. They basically give up. And it's the muskrat, is small muskrat, who has so much determination and says, I'm going to be able to do it. He goes down, he goes all the way to the bottom, and he's able to get some of the soil in his hands, and he brings that up. To the surface. Unfortunately, his efforts took him so long that he had no longer any breath, and basically he was not alive anymore. But the beaver goes and he takes from the muskrat's hands some of the soil that is in his hands, and he hands it to Sky Woman. And Sky Woman takes that. She gives thanks for everything that the animals and the birds do, and she begins to sing. And when she sings, she also dances, and she puts the soil on the ground. And when she puts it on the ground, as she dances in the same direction that we still do today. And I guess you would say that it goes in this direction, not the other way. And the soil and the turtle's back begin to enlarge. And the more she dances, the further out she goes, the bigger that gets. And today our people still call this Turtle Island because we are on the turtle's back. In the quilt that you saw a few seconds ago, I imagine that there is only the waterfowl and the water animals and a few of the other spirits that were here prior to the making of the world that saw that. And I tried to see it through their eyes, and that's the vision that you got in that quilt. Why was that important to me to do that quilt? Well, it was important, especially because I grew up in the city in Syracuse, and we were very close to any water except Onondaga Creek, which is a small little creek that went through Syracuse. And it wasn't until I was fully grown and I came to Akwesasne that I was really able to enjoy water on a constant basis. I met my husband, and we had a family, and we lived on the river. We still live on the river. His family owns land on both sides of the river, and so we're constantly going back and forth. And I used to go across the bridge, both bridges, many times, a few times a day sometimes. And I loved the river. It was beautiful. You could see for miles if you look down the river, but I was really concerned because what you could also see is dump tar, which was polluting our lands, and it put out a terrible smell. And GM, which was right next door to us, and we knew that they were putting dioxin and Mirex and different chemicals into the water. And then you had Reynolds Metals right there. And when I came to Akwesasne, I was one of the founders of the Freedom School. And the Freedom School that we started was right next to the GM plant. And so we moved about a mile away, but still to go in and out from the Freedom School, you had to pass the GM plant. And one of the terrifying things of the GM plant, especially in the afternoon, was that they had a water tower that was pretty huge. And so what you would see is you would see this shadow of the water tower. And for some reason, it always looked like a cobra. And I think there's a reason that it looked like a cobra is because they were poisoning our people. While we were on Racket Point, it became very clear that the poisoning that they were doing was not only in the water, it was in the air. And we were warned that farming was not a good idea. And at the time we had cows and we had pigs and chickens, and we planted, we had a nice farm going. And they said that you could only keep your cows for 2 years because some of the fluoride coming out of Reynolds would deteriorate their teeth to such a point that it was painful for them. And so you had to basically kill them and use their meat at that time. So it was pretty sad. It came, big change in lifestyle happened for a lot of people. A lot of people gave up farming. And then, so I was just like, why are we living here? Why are we living in this pollution? If I had so many beautiful children, why am I exposing them to this kind of pollution? So joined a group. Tommy Porter was working on trying to get some land down in Mohawk Valley and move people down to the valley and start over, and we were going to have this traditional community. So I helped him. I even went down there and helped look at some of the land that they were looking at. And I tried to convince my husband to go with me and bring our children down there. And he listened for a while, considered it for a long time, and then he just looked at me and he said, "No, I'm not going anywhere." And I would, "What do you mean you're not going anywhere?" I said, "It's all polluted here. We can't farm anymore." I said, "Why would we stay here?" And he said, "I grew up here. My people are buried here. My family is buried here." And he said, "Everything that I know is here. And I would rather stay here and help to clean the community, help to get us back to where we used to be, than to go somewhere else and start over." And so I still had a hard time with it. So one day he said, "Come on, let's go for a ride." And I thought we were going to go for a ride in the car, maybe go back across the bridges again. And he said he instead took a turn and we went down to the river. And we got in a boat and we went around Cornwall Island. We went around St. Regis Island, Yellow Island. We went down to Snipe. It was so beautiful. It was so refreshing. It was so magical. I have to say it was magical, romantic. It was everything. It was a beautiful day. The wind was so nice. And by that evening, the sun was coming down. And if anybody knows about how beautiful the sunset is on the St. Lawrence River, they know what I'm talking about. And by then I had seen homesteads, many homesteads we passed. I could see where the graveyards were. I could see places of worship. I saw fields that people had, and I just fell in love with Akwesasne in a way that I could never fall in love with it from the land. And I knew how he felt and why it was more important for us to stay and try to do something positive. And one of those positive things is to make sure that the Akwesasne Freedom School would continue to thrive. Luckily for me, staying here meant many things. And one of the things that the St. Lawrence River helped me with is that the St. Lawrence River is a very, very powerful river. The people who settled here know it was powerful because they harnessed the power of that river by putting in the dams. Unfortunately, when they did that, they also truncated some of the power of the rapids. The rapids that used to be here, that Akwesasne was named for. The Akwesasne means land where the partridge drums, and that partridge drumming is also the sound that the rapids used to make. Well, they don't make that sound anymore, but the river still gives off the medicine that those rapids used to bring for us. The water itself going through the rapids was a medicine, and people could use that to cleanse and help to heal themselves. So my time is up, but thank you for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Iakonikonriiosta. I think now we will hear from Jessica Jock.
Yes, thank you. And I'm so grateful to go after Cherie because she has inspired me in so many ways professionally, and listening to her story again and really hearing the power of the water, of the cleansing, the revitalization, the cultural appreciation of the Mohawk people is real important. I do work for the St. Regis Mohawk Tribes Environment Division, and I've based most of my career on focusing on the St. Lawrence River area of concern. And to present some context for the viewers, when we talk about Haudenosaunee territory and the different nations that make up the Haudenosaunee communities, I took this figure from online, hoping that it could maybe just help give some perspective. Although today we'll probably be talking mostly about the Akwesasne Mohawk community from my perspective and my work. I did want to note that there are other Mohawk communities downstream near Montreal, Ganapathy. They are near the Bahanoir Dam. And so when we're talking about the different impacts to water water of Haudenosaunee communities. You know, a lot of the impacts have come from either hydro dams or industrial activities and discharges. And up here, upstream in Lake Ontario, the Bay of Quinte, you have the Kanien'keha Mohawk community. And if you look throughout the rest of the New York State, you see Onondagas down here, and most of the other communities, Seneca, Tuscarora, they're on waters, Niagara River, Buffalo Creek. And in the work that I do, under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, there's been areas that have been identified as toxic hotspots historically. And these toxic hotspots, when looking at some of those impairments that Cherie was just mentioning, even the visual of the air plumes that were coming from the industrial discharge. So we here are on the St. Lawrence River, and we are part of a binational area of concern throughout the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement was a binational agreement between US and Canada that you can see all the spots on the map here. But also what I wanted to point out, because some of the focus is on Haudenosaunee communities and water and the significance of waterway life, the Bay of Quinte I just pointed in the previous map, that's where Kanien'keha, the Mohawk community, is. And then some of these other 18 Mile Creek, Buffalo River, Niagara River, these are all contaminated areas of concern also on Haudenosaunee or near Haudenosaunee territory or traditional territory. But if we were to focus just on the St. Lawrence River area of concern, this hopefully provides a little bit better context to some of the conversation today. You know, we had just heard about the realization of the beauty of the St. Lawrence River in Akwesasne around Cornwall Island here, St. Regis Island, Yellow Island. And what this map depicts is in all the shaded area in this blue area, this is the upstream boundary by Long Sault Island of what we're calling our area of concern on the St. Lawrence River. And these are all upstream boundaries as well. And then all of this water is considered impacted. But you see the shaded area in the colors, and this represents the Mohawk territory. And so when you have a discussion about any of the Messina industry, you just heard mention of the General Motors site, the former Reynolds Metal, Alcoa East, the former Alcoa West, now Arconic. You know, these are all the Messina contributing plants. There were also a number of industrial sources in the city of Cornwall on the Canadian side also. And so basically what you have in this visual here is you see that Akwesasne is downwind and down current of both Canadian and US industrial sources. And so there's that significance in terms of the sovereign territory, but also what does that mean for protectiveness of cultural uses of the river, the waters, and what does that mean to, from a Mohawk perspective rather than a regulatory perspective or a non-Indigenous person who may use the water and the fish and the animals differently. I always love hearing the Haudenosaunee and the creation story again, because it helps put that in perspective. So when we're monitoring the environment, you know, we're also looking at all of those, the animals, the turtles, the beaver, the muskrat, the different waters and the fish that are acknowledged in those oral traditions and the traditional teachings. So one last thing I just wanted to mention on this, the Lower Grass River, it is in the shading that indicates that it's traditional use area. But basically they're all protected by treaties, federal treaties that through different negotiations over time with the state and not the federal government had a different transaction with land. So the Lower Grass River is one of our primary Superfund sites, and I'll be talking about it in a little bit, but it's currently being remediated right now from industrial pollution sources. So with giving a little context also, we're talking about rivers of the past, present, and future. You know, one thing to keep in mind, we were talking, you know, about this area in particular, if we were to focus in on Akwesasne, and not the other Haudenosaunee communities. But these islands have been significant places in the traditional pathways of canoe routes, migration routes. And so there's archaeological evidence all throughout the islands of the St. Lawrence River. It's not just specific here, but it is through the whole St. Lawrence River, of indication of pre-contact sites. So a lot of times the perspective of some scientists is, or others, is to focus on the present, but to understand how the rivers, the water, and the land was used, you know, we want to factor that in as well. And so, you know, there are some sites on those islands that are as old as 10,000 years old. One of the sites in Quebec that was just, I don't know if it's even on this map, it's probably somewhere around here, I think. It's in the Dundee land claims, which is part of Mohawk traditional territory also. This village that was found, it's been renovated and revitalized for public access, actually, and it's a very cool site if anybody has a chance to get to it. But it just, again, identifies the past use of the river by Haudenosaunee people, or what in a historical term is being identified as St. Lawrence Iroquoian people. So if we talk about, again, water resources from a past fur trade, beaver, muskrat, otter, everything that was talked about in the beginning with Sky Woman creation story, the logging industry had impacts on the rivers and the streams in terms of fish passage, different fishing piers that Indigenous people used, you know, for easy access, fishing camps, things like that. And then the transition to your mills and your hydro dams, which then brought the industry. And then the industry is the indicator of what we discuss mostly today in our present evaluation and analysis of the environmental condition with pollution. The pollution being primarily the contaminants that are referred to as legacy contaminants that, you know, the pesticides, organochlorines, PCBs, mercury contamination. And those are the ones that have concern because of their persistence in the environment, and they don't break down readily. But when we're looking at other impacts to what's being defined as an area of concern, and I know there's other presenters on this panel that have a much greater detailed knowledge on them, is, you know, nutrient loading, bacteria, aquatic invasive species. But when we talk about how the integration of cultural use of the resources, when we look at the loss of wetlands and other Mohawk traditional plants that are used for medicinal uses, traditional food consumption, and what that means to an integration of a fear by the people, as, you know, if their medicines are contaminated, if the river and their fish are contaminated, what does that mean for how they interpret it as a personal attack on their own lifestyle and traditions? And we heard that a few minutes ago of that fear, and that fear of, you know, how do we respond in our community culture or protection of our own family when there's, you know, dirty water and dirty air all around us. So the present is we're evaluating those impacts, we're doing the studies. Where, just real quick, these are just a couple pictures of the dredging units that are actually on the Lower Grass River right now. So it's turned into a bit of a very construction zone area, but that is done in terms to effectively remove risk. And so as we move into the future, the important part is, you know, how do we better integrate those Mohawk cultural use metrics and those indicator species that are outlined in the traditional teachings and the stories, and the species that are important for consumption that may not be a species that's typically monitored, such as medicinal plants or lake sturgeon that isn't usually monitored for those things, but yet there's fish consumption advisories for those species. And then as we continue with the clean resources, how do we better revitalize cultural use with a restored river and habitat resource? So that's, in a very quick way, trying to summarize about 30 to 50 years of at least current work and 10,000 years of history for the next presenter, Ms. Sateiokwen.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And yes, I would like to now turn to Sateiokwen.
My name is Sateiokwen, as I mentioned. I don't even know how to follow that, you know. I was hoping it would just come to me. So I guess I'll start by going back, and this kind of ties to Iakonikonriiosta. She mentioned the Akwesasne Freedom School. I'm a Freedom School alumni. It's where I think I got my interest and passion for our culture, or Kanien'keha culture and language. It always kind of stuck with me. I find our language to be very complicated and difficult, but some things are just sticky. And I also went to Syracuse University, where I graduated with a bachelor's degree. And I found that even though I was able to do the work, I was never really into it. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. Textbooks and lectures and all that information, it just didn't stick. It wasn't sticky for me. And that's the only way I can really describe it. I went through the motions, you know, like you graduate high school, you go to college, and thankfully they had the Haudenosaunee Promise at Syracuse University. So it was a great opportunity to have a full scholarship. And so after I graduated there, I kind of bounced around doing different jobs, nothing I was really passionate about, until the Akwesasne Cultural Restoration Program did a call out for apprentices. And I applied as a traditional medicine and healing apprentice, and thankfully they chose me. So for 4 years, I worked with 2 masters, Alicia Cook and Louise Hearn, for the first year, and then Ernest David came in for the final years. And I learned so much, and I'm so thankful for that opportunity. And the Akwesasne Cultural Restoration Program, or ACR, as I call it, as it's known, it came out of the contamination within the area. Because of the contamination, as Iakonikonriiosta mentioned, there was a fear, and Jessica mentioned, there was a fear of all the contamination, how it's affecting our health. So our people stopped fishing, and we were a fishing community. That was our livelihood. Our diet depended on it as well. And so it changed a lot of people's professional lives, recreational, their health. People stopped gardening because they didn't trust the soil. They stopped gathering medicines because they didn't trust that they would, you know, make our people feel better. What if they made them feel worse? They stopped hunting and trapping. And so when the program was created, they identified these areas that were impacted the most. And because we were no longer doing those traditional activities, we were also no longer using the language that went along with it. And so for those 4 years, I learned a lot about the other categories, the fishing and water usage, hunting and trapping, traditional foods and horticulture, and then my category of the traditional healing and medicines. Is where I really focused on, but I had to know a little bit about all the other ones because they're all connected. You know, some fish are medicine, food is medicine. You know, we utilize some of the animal parts in medicine as well. And so that's really where I got my start on focusing on like my medicines and healing. And so after the program, I decided I didn't want to go back to one of my jobs that I was not happy with. So I created my own business, Snipe Botanicals, and I also started working with Jessica Jock as a contractor. I just felt like the business and the contracting work went hand in hand. You know, making medicines and providing education on how to use the medicines to our community, while also working with Jessica at the Environment Division and the remediation efforts that they're going through, working with DEC and EPA, and making sure that they keep in mind the importance of Mohawk traditional use. And moving forward, or actually right now, it's been pretty groundbreaking. You know, we've had, I mean, Jessica could probably tell you more about this, or maybe we'll do this in discussion, but, you know, we're making these steps forward and being included into these areas of decision making where we haven't, Akwesasne hasn't been before, or even Ngwehue or natives haven't really been participating at that table. But now we're going out and collecting data. We did a survey along the river, the Grass River, and surveyed all of the plants, utilized that information to propose, you know, how they should be cleaning up the river, what plants should be replanted, and hopefully bring back the people of Akwesasne to those traditional areas where, you know, our great-grandparents, our ancestors used to go to gather and collect medicines. But because of the contamination, we stopped. But after all this work, that's one of my goals, or I hope to see, is that our people go back to some of those areas and they start to go back to those traditional practices. And I think after this pandemic that got everybody, you know, buying toilet paper, they also started gardening. And I think that's one of the first steps, and that's really gonna push people to go back to our roots and start planting our traditional foods, start gathering our traditional medicines, start hunting and fishing again. And I really hope that we can go with this momentum and continue to teach and continue to learn. And we're at a pivotal moment in time because a lot of our knowledge holders, they're our elders, and, you know, it's sad they pass away, and we need to really work really hard to keep some of this knowledge alive. And that was one of the things that I learned from the cultural restoration program, is some of these, you know, these stories, going and talk with our elders and our different medicine people. You know, how do we use our traditional medicines? What are the names? What are the protocols and the, you know, the proper picking and handling and administering, and how do you do all these things in a respectful manner? And that's just something that I think is very important. And I think other people are going to start realizing that, and that they are realizing it. And I'm just so thankful that there's these panels like this where we can talk about these types of, you know, issues or just topics in general and have this discussion. And I think this is really going to help push forward that momentum into everything we need to do. And I hope I continue my work with Jessica as much as I can. I have a 10-month-old daughter, so sometimes doing all these things is a little overwhelming, being a first-time mom. I'm sure some of you out there will understand. But that's also why I'm trying so hard to stick with my language and go out and, you know, plant my gardens and my medicines. You know, we don't always know what we're doing at the time, but, you know, we're going to just keep going, because we're doing the best that we can. And I hope that I can make a better world for my daughter, because growing up on the St. Regis River, you know, my grandmother was born on St. Regis Island. That the house that she lived in, or that she was born in, is still there today. And we go out to the island and, you know, put my daughter in her little life jacket. We hop on a boat, and it's kind of a natural everyday thing for her. We don't do it every day, but it's becoming natural for her. So just as much as I was on the river, I hope she is, and I hope it's going to be just as clean, where she will be able to swim in it when she's older. And, you know, I hope my grandkids will be able to swim in that river like we are today. So I just want to thank everybody for this time, and our panelists are just great, and I can't wait to hear the discussion. So I'll stop there and give it back to Sandhya.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sateiokwen. So to move on, I think we can turn to Willbanks.
Thank you, Sandy. So for me to talk about my relationship with the Great River and with waterways in general, it's pretty obvious that mine truly is likely a settler's tale, quite colonial in its background. But someone else has mentioned that they're on a journey. I think I have been too. And maybe I'll start with what I think is the punchline and then work my way back to it at the end. And the punchline came to me when I was preparing for another presentation a few years ago. And I came across a report from the UN, a high-level panel on water. And after lots of meetings, lots of research, they sort of summed up the value of water in 3 words. It's precious, it's fragile, and it's dangerous. And that truly is where I think I've come to see water. I grew up in the urban South, but I was fortunate that I was able as a kid to spend a lot of time on the water, the rivers and streams in rural Alabama. And totally unconsciously, I experienced the preciousness of water that I think all of us still feel, and you hear weaving through the stories of the people are saying tonight, that what it means to us when we're on it, when we're near it, when we experience it. I just as a kid it didn't raise to my consciousness. Years later, I moved to the north and become an attorney and have a joint degree, law degree, and master's in public administration. And for many years, I worked as an environmental attorney for an independent power producer. And I think, again, probably unconsciously, became quite attuned to the fragility of water because I worked for a company that at least was decent in their approach, and we wanted to protect the source, the water we were using, but we were using it, and it was a resource and a commodity for us. It was something we knew there were limits to what we could do, and we tried to stay within those, and we were fairly successful. But it still, once it went through the process, it didn't go out and return the same way that we had gotten it. Later, I worked as a chief of staff for a New York State senator whose district included most of the Great River and the watershed and a lot of the eastern shore of Lake Ontario. And boy, that was an eye-opening experience where the complexity of all of the competing interests that you can imagine we have in water, from riparians to industry to drinking water and so on, became very apparent. And I guess as a culminating experience, and probably the most satisfying, was the 6 years that I recently spent as the riverkeeper for the Upper St. Lawrence River. And perhaps as an aside, but as a real critical piece to my development, was the fact that I met and was schooled by a wide range of people, advocates, scientists, Indigenous and First Nations leaders who all have a perspective on the river. Some of them are panelists tonight: Jessica Jock, coming up, Tony David, Michael Twist, Lee McGaughy, but also Henry Lickers, and just a wide range. And on the other side, I also had frequent and not necessarily always pleasant experiences with the principal users of the river as a resource, as I had once done. And I guess, large among those were the shippers and the Seaway Development Corporation, who have, I think, consciously and in a very decided way, rebranded our river as Highway H2O, which basically has reduced it to infrastructure. And much like the highways of the past, it's allowed them to litter it with a tremendous range of non-native and invasive species that are doing great harm to the species that we rely on, that have always been part of the river and part of the culture here. And of course, the dams that enable that shipping to occur on the scale that it does clearly have shown the dangerousness of water and the inability of us to build a structure that controls the water in a way that protects us from the harms that can come from it. But you know, it was through working with other water keepers from all over the world and advocates far and wide, many of whom were dealing with more immediate, more intense threats, that I realized how quickly a body of water can be fouled. And we've heard mention of some of those already tonight. Lead in Flint, Michigan's water from just thoughtless change to save money. We'll probably talk a little bit about the threat of industrial agriculture and what that means to waterways. Climate change, what's happening to the temperature of our waters, and you know, excessive nutrient runoffs and the combination leading to harmful algal blooms. So I think we're at a pivotal moment. I think we're at a moment where we all have a choice. And so sort of, I guess, to put a bow on this and say where I am right now, I'm going to go back to the precious, fragile, and dangerous. And that's been informed by all the times that I've been lucky enough to sit through the words that come before all others. And if you listen, and fortunately, many times it's been in English so that my untrained ears can understand more of what's going on. Water is a key part of that. And everything else that's mentioned, whether it's animate or inanimate, is equal. We're all just on a plane. It's not a resource, it's not a commodity, it's just equal. And I think our relationship with all those other things, but also more particularly with water, has to be based on that equality, or we're not going to get it right. And I think we have to work at it, because if we don't, we're not going to keep water precious. We're not going to protect its fragility, and we're certainly not going to learn how to live with its dangerousness. And I guess that's where I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Lee. Thank you. And so our final speaker for this evening is Shane Rogers. So I'll turn it to Shane.
Thank you. So that was really a great introduction, actually. And thank you, Lee, for setting up some of the things that I'm going to want to talk about a little bit tonight. You know, before we had this session, or before we came together tonight, we had an opportunity for each of us to meet each other and to learn about our past experiences with this place in the watershed. And you know, I listened to other people, you know, explain their connections and their histories and their experiences. And, you know, I kept circling back to, man, I'm such a settler here. Like, holy smokes. You know, I came here from another place. You know, you know, several years back, I got a subscription to Ancestry.com. And, you know, if you've ever had that before the DNA stuff happened, then you know, it's a lot of hard work. You go back and forth through that. You trace through old, you know, phone records and phone books and you know, old Quaker meeting minutes and all those things. And it's, you know, it's crazy what you find. But you know, my family, you know, we're just the classic settlers. You know, we came from, it turns out, Western Europe, and you know, we settled oddly enough through New York State, in Pennsylvania back in the 1700s was the earliest I could get back. You know, and then another wave of Irish and Danes coming through in the 1800s, and you know, and those groups, they moved west, both to the north and to the south. You know, over until around the late 1800s when they ended up in Iowa. And so that's, you know, that's where I come from. But, you know, what makes it worse is that here I am back in New York. So I'm not just a settler, I'm a resettler of the area, which is horrible. But, you know, it made me think about a lot of things. And one of the things, you know, as I was thinking about this, it kind of came up was that, you know, we have this oral history. I know a lot of other families have an oral history that kind of co-opts Native American heritage, and that's been around in my family for a really long time, you know, and I could go through the ancestry.com and I could explore things, I could trace my past. It's like, you know, I'd see we're colonizing from here and there and all that sort of thing. And this day came when, you know, they have the DNA testing. And so you can go and get your DNA tested, and for sure, nothing there. We're definitely not Native American. You know, I could take that to my dad and say, hey, you know, we're not, this is not us, Dad. You know, this, I know you like the story, but it's not us. And, you know, and he got super angry and still doesn't want to believe it, you know, and you know, it's one of those stories where I think there became a time when that became something romantic, and it's a strange co-opting that happened. And, you know, my grandmother kind of shared that story with him. My grandmother shared a story of my grandfather not being able to talk about these things, and you know, and so that because it was through his family line, and you know, and I was probably the closest to my grandfather, and you know, and oddly going through the ancestry stuff, I could trace back. I mean, there's this choice, you know, it's like either this is connection where his grandfather or my great grandfather was Native American, or this other guy from Ohio, you know, that settled is like, oh, I got the DNA evidence. I kind of know where this goes to, you know. But after all of this, you know, and even remembering my grandpa, who I was really close with, I asked him one time, he never talked to anybody ever about it. And he, one time when he was very old, this was his last year of life, and I asked him about it, and he had a breathing tube inserted in his later years. He had cancer, and he covered it up, and he mouthed the word Choctaw, and I had no idea what that meant. I'm like, okay, I don't know. As it turns out, Ancestry.com has now updated their DNA database, and sure enough, there exists that link. Now, I'm not here to say I'm like claiming that. Definitely have no histories in my family that would ever, like, I had no connection to any of that anymore. Although what I think is interesting and important is that we're here talking about all these things and our connection to the land, and we're going to talk about science. We're going to talk about engineering and what we could be doing and what's been done up until this point. And I think one thing that I reflected on going through this process was who creates the science? Who creates the truth that we know? And, you know, who's excluded from that creation, from the story that we're telling each other? And when you think about something like Ancestry.com, where the DNA is the records are being created, and we're learning about our family histories, who are the people taking those tests? Who can afford those tests? Where is that information coming from? And I think that's a really critical thing to think about as we're moving forward tonight. Who's created our truth about what is possible, about what we can do? And how do we put that in check? You know, how do we change that so that, you know, we can imagine something that's better than what we have right now? And so one thing that I think, moving back to the conversation, I grew up in Iowa, and so I saw it's a very large agriculture state, of course. And I saw a lot of my friends and farms, a lot of their families being impacted throughout the 70s and 80s with the farm crisis. And I saw the move towards, industrialized agriculture that's pervasive in the state. And I became interested in these sorts of things. And so when I went and got my degree in environmental engineering, and I had to make a decision, where am I going to go next? I decided to chase that pathway down and went towards the EPA so that I could work on problems of large-scale agriculture. So in that work, very early on, as I was starting to learn more about how things were created, I started to learn about how industry had infiltrated into the creation of agriculture and how it created a story around what was possible and what was not possible, importantly, and how we should do agriculture versus how agriculture had been historically done. This picture is a result of that interaction. And what you're looking at here is an aerial, a satellite image, and overlaid on that satellite image is the 100-year floodplain. This happens to be from North Carolina, so this is a place where I've done some work. And you can see some large hog farms. So this particular farm has several thousand hogs, and in each one of these buildings is a little over 1,000 hogs, packed in so tight that when they reach full weight, they literally stand shoulder to shoulder on their concrete pins and on their slatted floors, and all the waste that they produce gets flushed out into this large open pit. And that's flushed by taking the liquid that's in this large open pit and flushing it through the hog houses to take that feces, that excrement, back out into this pit where it just decays and produces such a massive stench that you can hardly bear it if you stand next to these. And the industry will promote the idea that this doesn't smell, that this is safe. You can see the 100-year floodplain. We live in an age where we have a changing global climate, where we have increasing frequency of flooding, increasing frequency of damage, and this place where we have 100-year floods at this same farm, you can see what happens. This is not a 100-year flood that's occurring, but you can see what's happened. Very unfortunately, this lagoon was in a recent hurricane overtoppled. And so some of its lagoon materials came out. What interaction does that have? What does this have for the people who live next to this? These people that live here. Who are the people that live here? Poor, non-white predominantly, people who have no power to overcome these things. Who are the people that live with this in their neighborhood, who live with this in this water situation in their community? What can we do, to prevent this? The industry would have you think that things like this are not possible, that they're not economically viable. Yet this fella, this anaerobic digester here, and you can see in the background solar panels, he does this. There's no reason why anybody else can't. So do we believe in those? Do we believe when we hear these kind of things? What can we do that's different? This guy, when the power goes out in his neighborhood, he turns it on for a couple hundred residences in his neighborhood, using the gas that's produced in his digester, using his solar panels and his microgrid system. Why can't we reimagine our place into something like that? I just want us thinking about some of these issues in a different way. What's on the horizon? We may not be facing some of these here right at this very moment. Are we trending towards those things? What can we do to stave those off? And how can we reimagine the way we do our things to do something better? So with that, I'm just going to turn it back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shane, and thank you to all of the panelists. I have to say my job as moderator, well, when I started off, I said this whole process is as part of my learning experience. And so that's exactly what's happened this evening. And I think my job as moderator was try to keep time, but I also felt like I couldn't because the words that were being shared were so impactful, so profound, and so important to the conversation. So we've totally gone over, but we also, we'll also make time and make space for some conversation and for discussion. So for those of you who are joining us on Zoom or through the Weave News, if you're on Zoom, please post any questions that you might have for any of the panelists using the Q&A feature. And for those of you joining through the Weave News, use the link on YouTube. But I guess maybe I will start while I wait for any questions to come on in. And so I thought, you know, one of the questions I asked us all to think about was to reflect on the future, and to reflect on the future of the watershed. And I guess I'll just ask this question broadly. What are some key issues that you see that we need to think about in terms of the future? How we can imagine solutions to create this more just, life-sustaining, regenerative relationship with the water. So I will put that question out there broadly and see who picks it up. What are our thoughts about the future?
I'd like to take on that question. And the reason I'd like to take it on is because my family's been affected by the whole watershed, and we were probably the last holdouts, probably one of the last farms. And then just recently, we were one of the last people in our area to have a well. Everybody was basically forced into doing a water line because the water in our part of Akwesasne, a lot of people felt it was contaminated, and they were unfortunately not able to connect toward their well. Well, we kept on our well for a long time until it was finally to the point that our well couldn't be cleaned anymore. You could put as much Clorox down there as you wanted and as often as you wanted, and after a while, it just wouldn't get cleaned anymore. So we had to finally get onto the water system, and that water system is directly coming from the St. Lawrence River. And I have talked to environmentalists on both sides, and even though we have probably the most up-to-date water cleaning plants, the problem is that yes, it can clean out lots of debris, it can clean out bacteria, but it can't clean out heavy metals. And the heavy metals are probably still in the water. I think that in the future, we have to really ramp it up a little bit so that we don't have to be afraid of the heavy chemicals that are in the water. Also, what we need to do along the whole St. Lawrence River is to figure out a way that sewage can be treated before it is put back into the water system. Most of us in our community we aren't part of a joint sewage cleaning system before it goes back into the river. Or some people are always worried that the sewage treatment plants that we have are overflowing before it goes back into the river. So everybody is always very conscious of how clean or how dirty the water is. So I think that our future, hopefully we have throughout the whole community, we have a sewage system that works and that it doesn't pollute the river before the water goes back into that system. That's what I would like to see in my district and throughout Akwesasne. But all of those rivers, everything from Love Canal all the way down the St. Lawrence just keeps coming, and it hits Akwesasne, and now it must go down to Montreal, and everybody screams when Montreal says we're dumping 50 million gallons of waste into the river, and Ganapathy is all up in arms and everything. I feel like each individual homeowner that is dumping, or that they don't have a good septic system, and that water eventually hits either the water table or it flows out into the St. Lawrence, is part of the problem. Wittingly or unwittingly, a friend of mine once said, every snowflake denies its culpability in an avalanche. And I think that if we all open our eyes and see how we are culpable in the problem, maybe it's time for us to start taking responsibility and find a way to clean it up, because it's like Sateiokwen said, our next generation keeps happening. We just keep bringing more and more beautiful babies, and we owe it to them to make sure that the land is clean. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else wants to speak to this question about the future?
Yeah, I'll just what Iakonikonriiosta was saying, you know, we always got to keep in mind our future generations. You know, like I'm personally, you know, I think about my family, my daughter. If my daughter decides to have a family of her own, like, are they going to be able to utilize these various water systems in Akwesasne, and what is that going to mean? And it is a lot of work. As I watch Jessica go through her everyday, I don't even know what she does every day, but I know she stays really busy and she works really hard to keep the best interest of Akwesasne in mind. And it is going to take a lot of work, and we're going to need people who are both passionate about their culture and language to make sure that it sustains and that we can utilize our natural resources, but also we need, you know, our academics and educators going in and learning and how do we fix the system. So it's going to be a lot of work.
Thank you. I see some questions coming into the Q&A, so I'll relay those to our panelists. One question, and I think this is directed to everyone. Since restoration is the focus of all of your work, how do we convince the public to understand this?
I think that's a great question, and I think as an advocate, it's something we're always struggling with. And sort of going back to your question, I may be the pessimist in the group, but I think at least in the United States, as we're seeming to move away from an acceptance of science and reliance on rationality, we're struggling. I think you know, I've said this before. We work in a lot of organizations. We put pretty pictures up and tell people this is what we need to preserve. I don't think that's been enough. And unfortunately, it's sometimes a Flint level event that focuses the mind, and people then demand restoration. You know, we've moved away from our original environmental movement, but it was because we were on the brink of disaster. And the other day, the Cuyahoga burned again. So I guess we just have to, we have to work. We have to try to get people to realize that whether it's traditional knowledge or Western science, there's a basis and there's a history. And I think it's telling stories, whether it's through art, it's explaining the quilt so that people feel a connection. I've heard the mothers talk to the EPA about the Grass River, and it was one of the most moving things I've heard. But even then, our government sort of shut them down and took the least cost alternative. But I do think bringing people to the water, making a connection so that they see, feel, and hear the impacts. And even though it may be small groups and individuals, that may be the way we have to go.
Yeah, I'll just add real quick too. I know later in the whole session of this event, I think the last panel includes a watershed approach and what that means. And you even heard today different panelists talk about these source-related impairments, whether it's agricultural runoff, bacterial toxins, industrial contaminants, even personal use sewage, discharge, and other things. But if the urgency, it's hard because you're constantly putting out the fires, like Lee had said. But if there's more of a collaborative approach, that the perspective and the lens that I work from is taking on that Hodengali perspective, because it's looking at the system holistically and everything together. And And if you're just focusing on the wetlands, then and not the water levels, then you're not really addressing the issue. And if you're just looking at one source of contaminants, but not the agriculture, then you're not looking at all the water impacts. And as climate change takes place and water becomes more of an important commodity, we're going to be constantly playing catch up to try to, you know, respond to those impacts rather than plan. And I know there's another session later on that talks about planning for the watershed in the future. But I think today's session was important to really bring that the Haudenosaunee perspective, the Haudenosaunee and the stories to have that broad picture and integrative collaborative approach. And hopefully, you know, as we proceed down this path, we can make better management decisions.
Well, if I could add what you just said, Jessica, I have a half-formed idea that unfortunately I don't have the research chops to put behind it. But working with a group of concerned citizens in Cornwall who formed the Great River Network, sitting, listening to them organically look at problems and try to solve them, it's occurred to me that we might try the community garden approach. I mean, the idea that it's not a plot of land, but it's the water that we depend on, and we all have to take care of it in our own way, because we're all sharing it with us and everybody downstream. I need somebody smarter than I am and with more eloquent to develop that out. But I think that couples people, you know, when you put your hands in the dirt, you feel a connection. And somehow we have to get people to feel that connection and that urgency there.
And Jessica and Lee, those are like really great points. And that's exactly hitting the nail on the head. And I think we live now in a day where, you know, it's been too easy in the past for people to make it somebody else's problem, somebody else's impact. It's not going to hurt me. It's too easy to move on. And we live in a day where we have the potential to get those stories out, so you can personalize the damage that's done. You know, to understand or to connect with the stories of people who live with these, to understand that it could happen to you just as easily as it can happen to somebody else. And I think that has to be part of the solution. I think we see some of that emerging in the pandemic, in the situation that we're in now. We see people mobilizing to a greater extent than we've ever seen before, because people have the time to slow down and to take a look at what's happening. And people are spending more time taking a look at what's happening and realizing that that can be them as well. And I just feel that has to be part of the solution.
I think that as long as we give people hope that things can get better, that we don't set up our next generation to think that, we're so polluted or climate change has happened so fast that they don't have to care anymore. I think you take away hope, that you'll take away that part of it that our children need to say, my generation can make a difference and will try to make a difference. We have to always have that in our teachings for them. In that quilt, when she takes a hold of that soil, she takes that soil, and later in the story, it tells us that all life comes from the soil, right? There's life in there, and from that life is what the Creator used to make all the other life on earth. When he did that, he said that all life coming from the soil will return to the soil. There's balance in almost everything that we do. So if we can teach our children that soil came from the water, and that soil is we are so dependent on it. Like he said, they have gardens. That's a real good first step. I think that's what we have to do is get our children to touch the soil again, to feel the soil, and to feel responsible for it. And we need to plant that in them. And hopefully they can help us find those solutions that we need, and that they don't lose hope into the future.
Thank you. So we have many more questions. We also have time constraints. I thought I would ask at least one more question, and then we can see where the conversation takes us, and then we can decide if it's time for us to wrap things up. And so there was quite a few questions asking about like traditional ecological knowledge. And so one question was, in what ways are traditional ecological knowledge, or is traditional ecological knowledge being utilized and incorporated into the management and ecological restoration efforts? So yes, our traditional knowledge is being kind of incorporated into solutions.
So I will try to narrow the focus on maybe one project, and the project that Sateiokwen assisted us with. And so before you can even apply traditional ecological knowledge in this context from a Mohawk perspective of traditional use plants for medicine, or traditional foods that grow naturally along the river shoreline or in wetlands, you have to know what's there. And from a scientific perspective, we're familiar with invasive species that have taken over. And so your wetlands or your shoreline species have been impacted by so many different anthropogenic uses, whether it's people mowing their lawns, and so now you just have a green lawn, or the wetlands that have been taken over by Phragmites, or other things like that. And so when we're talking about wetland health or shoreline health on a river system, when we went out and did our surveys, we used a different approach. We used, again, that Mohawk perspective lens of where, because of the Haudenosaunee teachings, like all plants are important, or if it has a medicinal use or a traditional food use, and there are some like cattails, groundnut, things like that have historical records of being consumed traditionally. You know, do they grow there? Are they healthy and abundant? And if not, you know, can we plant them instead of a species that's being grown in a greenhouse, you know, in Ohio, that is, you know, maybe it's a species that's native to the region in the watershed and it can grow in our cold climate, but it doesn't have that consumption or that medicinal value that likely has been native and natural in this environment before any other impact. So we use the scientific approach of trying to understand what's there, what could be there, what the environment would support for growth, and then the knowledge of historical records, traditional teachings, and medicinal traditional food plant knowledge to say, okay, these are the plants that we want to plant, and they also serve an ecological service and a function, whether that service and function is you know, just in the wetland itself or the shoreline, or it's food for muskrat and beavers, or it serves as housing for a beaver, or it's used as food for people. So that's probably the best example I can give, and I hope that answers the question. But it's a very integrated approach, and it takes a long time to, you know, it's not something where, and often, you know, another question we always get is, well, can you just document this traditional ecological knowledge and just share it? It's that learning in the environment with the language, because the language is part of the knowledge. The language has a whole story that associates with it, and maybe the use of that plant or that animal, and then and some of the practices of the collection and the ceremony and the purpose like that. And so it's not as easy as just give me a list and we can integrate this everywhere. It's a whole learning process and application.
Yeah, and it is important, and it does benefit and the science side, but there is always that difficulty between the traditional knowledge is always more qualitative, and then the science is more quantitative, and we're always back and forth. Well, can you just give me a list of numbers of plants that you want? And it gets a little hard. Or how do you make a survey for the community about what they want to eat, or what medicines they used to see, or about the different stories that their grandparents used to tell about fishing or being on the river, how do you quantify that type of traditional knowledge? How do you quantify something that's traditionally passed on orally, you know, through stories? And while it is difficult to navigate those two paths side by side, it is very important because it does add so much more to that information and to the experience. And working with Jessica, we've done work along the Grass River with the remediation efforts. I've also been a part of the plant nursery group that the SRMT, St. Regis Mohawk Tribes Environment Division has started, just to see, you know, what type of plants do we want grown? You know, is it going to be the typical food plants that every other greenhouse has, or are we going to go with traditional plant medicines, traditional plant foods, or fruit and nut trees for the health of the community? We're even doing, you know, area of concerns and BUIs, you know. I won't get into the acronyms. I'm not the science person. I'm the traditional ecological knowledge holder. And that was only because I grew up here. I went to the Freedom School where I learned a lot of, you know, things you don't necessarily realize are important because, you know, you're like 5 to 10 years old. And it's just something that's ingrained. You hear around the community. I learned at ACR program. So everything that I've gathered, all this knowledge I've collected over the years, I try to utilize that in the conversations that they have. When they get all sciencey, I try to participate by saying, well, you know, this reminds me of this story that I once heard about, you know, creation story, or it ties to the great law and how we function today. And so it's difficult because a lot of that knowledge, you have to be careful how you share it, or if you even share it. And so it takes a lot of work, and I'm really thankful that, you know, I have support like Jessica and other community members who are just great at what they do. So it makes those conversations flow, and we incorporate that information as best we can into the science side of these projects and restoration efforts.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your both of your responses. So I think at this point, I had 2 more questions I thought we could use as kind of like a closing moment or closing conversation. So I'm just going to pair these 2 questions. So one person asks, in what ways can people support the Mohawks of Akwesasne and this restorative effort? And then the second question, this comes to us from someone writing from Mexico. And they say, you know, my question is, how can we support each other? How can we break the border to support? We must maintain the consciousness that we are a part of a world where we inhabit with vital elements for our existence. I would like to receive material to better understand the subject and to be able to give my support. Thank you very much. And so I thought maybe we could reflect on that and speak to that as a way to close, thinking about how can we support each other, support the Mohawk community, but then also support more broadly. So, would anybody like to pick that one up?
Yes, I'd like to just say that people talk about nowadays, they seem to understand what it is to be politically woke, right? You're conscious of everything that's going on around you politically, and you're trying to do something about it. Well, we also need to be environmentally woke. We need to teach our people and our children especially that they have to consider everything that they do in relationship to each other, and that we live within a network, we live within a system called the Mother Earth, and that everything affects each other. And so, yes, we have to reach across the border. The St. Lawrence River is a prime example of us having to reach across that border to be able to, because the water doesn't recognize that border. I think if we can teach each other to, every decision that we have to make, we have to consider the environment, whether we choose plastic or glass, whether we use one system or another system, to that they have to be conscious. And as much as they can be conscious, that's where your traditional, not ecological knowledge will come into play. You make the decision that is best for the most instead of what is just best for me.
Mm-hmm. And I think going back to the Untitled, you know, that's something that supports all of us. You know, if you take us as human beings out of this world, everything else would thrive. And so as human beings, like it's our duty as caretakers of this earth to make sure that there is something still here for our future generations. And so going back to what Iakonikonriiosta was saying, you know, how do we support the Mohawks of Akwesasne, or how do we support one another? It's, you know, going back to acknowledging and being respectful to all those things that are out in nature that I recited in the Untitled, you know, it's all very important, and it's the one thing that connects all of us, you know, through borders, through, you know, cross cultures, it connects all of us, you know, it doesn't matter where we come from, we all depend on all those things.
Yeah, and I would just suggest that if people are really interested to assist, you know, in some sort of way, I think reading and learning, you know, the history of different indigenous communities. There's over 500 and some federally recognized tribes in the U.S. borders alone, and so each tribe interacts differently, or they have similar but different creation stories, different environmental uses, resources, things like that. And so sometimes just becoming aware of who your neighbors are. Mm-hmm. One thing, I grew up in a community just adjacent to Akwesasne, so I was familiar through my childhood, but I didn't really learn about Akwesasne until I had a professional job working for the community. And, you know, sometimes it's like this awareness of, wow, like there's this community right next door that is perceiving the environment in a different lens, or is impacted in a different way than just another community 5-10 miles down the road. And sometimes it's just an awareness. And I think, you know, there's enough indigenous communities around North America that I think if you just look around to see who your neighbors are, and to see like how maybe that self-awareness and community culture awareness could help even just locally for yourselves. So.
Mm-hmm.
Any other thoughts on that question?
I think, you know, communication. If we need to communicate, we need to share our knowledge. We need to accept that we're all connected. We need to listen to each other's stories, listen to the knowledge that may be gained in one place, and try to figure out how that might be useful for somewhere else, while respecting what knowledge is there. Working globally on water problems, I find that oftentimes the knowledge exists within the communities that I work with, but sometimes it's just lost among that own community, because, you know, they've gone through a process where we're constantly fed what's in the media, we're constantly fed what's, you know, the industrial machine tells us, and so those things that work and that have worked for years, you know, we're taught sometimes that they're not good. And, you know, as I was reflecting back on one of the traditional knowledge kind of areas, I was working on a water project in Ecuador, and we were asking the community, we had all these ideas for how we could bring, you know, clean water into the community and work, you know, and do those things. And we were just talking with them about, you know, here's some different ideas. And somebody finally spoke up and said, you know, I really like this one, because it reminds me when we had, you know, this old guy, you know, that lived, you know, down the road here, and he used to filter all of his water through this rock. and it was so good, and he never got sick, and it was always, you know, always very clean. And it turns out, you know, they're in a volcanic region, and the only thing I can guess, it was maybe like a pumice, and so this led us towards creating ceramic water filters for the community, because that's something that they were familiar with, something that they would use, something that works. And you know, working in Africa, very similar. You know, we have community stretch looking for ways to get clean water, and you know, they want to use a surface water source, because that's what the National Water and Sewerage Company does. They go in and they do a surface water source, and they make a big expensive water treatment plant, and then water comes to the community. But at the same time, you know, we've found people who still dig wells in a traditional way. And it's not a way that I would ever have imagined myself, because I've never seen it before. But to see, you know, two guys dig a well 60 some feet down under the ground, and put that together, and now we're, you know, for between $6,000 and $10,000, we can put in a groundwater well that serves 1,000 people, you know, for many, many years. So even if it only worked for 10 years, you know, with the solar pump and everything on it, it's like $1 for everybody to get water for 10 years. It's amazing. And we would never have thought about that had we not went in and listened and watched and learned something, but then also help them by applying our knowledge. How do we, you know, put power here to make a pump that works, you know, so we can put in a solar system and make that work for you as well. And so communication, I think, is really key in opening those conversations up between different places, and thinking about things respectfully, and acknowledging the knowledge that's there and working with it.
Thank you. So, I mean, with that, I personally want to extend my gratitude to Sinsun and Blake for organizing this, but especially to all of the panelists here. And this is coming from me. I'm sure it's also going to come from everybody on Zoom and who's joining us on the Weave. But this was very enriching, very enlightening, and it's part of my life learning. So, sincere thank you to everyone, and for sharing your knowledge. So I think at this point I will turn it back to Sinsun and Blake.
Number one, again, just echoing with everything Sandhya said, sincere gratitude towards all of you for everything that you shared with us, shared with the people that are in the panel, shared with the world. All the knowledge is just still percolating through me. I still feel it flowing, and it's still making these connections, and I'm sure it's making connections for everyone who was lucky enough to be watching you speak, you share, to be listening to your words. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you really for your words and your time and sharing all your knowledge. And also we want to thank the audience for all your questions and contributions. So I think this is a wrap up. Thank you, everybody. Have an amazing night, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the panelists.
Yeah.
Oh,